Welcome to Behavioral Health Today, a podcast brought to you by the Triad Network. This podcast is designed to share trending topics occurring within the world and our communities and bring them a behavioral and mental health perspective.
Welcome to Behavioral Health Today. I'm your host, Sharlee Dixon. My guest today is Dr. Robert Melillo. Robert is a leading expert in childhood neurological disorders and the creator of the groundbreaking Melillo method, a holistic approach to addressing brain imbalances in patients of all ages. For over 30 years, he has helped thousands of children and adults overcome challenges related to autism, ADHD, dyslexia, and other learning, behavioral, and emotional disorders. A clinician, researcher, university professor, and best-selling author, Dr. Melillo's work blends cutting-edge neuroscience with practical tools in diet, nutrition, and lifestyle to promote lasting brain and body balance. His influential book, Disconnected Kids, and its follow-ups have empowered parents and professionals worldwide to better understand and transform neurological function. Today, he continues to innovate in the fields of brain health and neurodevelopment, offering hope and results where traditional approaches often fall short. In this episode, we explore Dr. Melillo's groundbreaking approach to identifying and correcting brain imbalances, linking early development, functional disconnection, nutrition, gut health, and brain plasticity to transform how we understand, prevent, and treat neurological, behavioral, and learning disorders in people of all ages. Dr. Melillo, I'm so excited to have you on the show today. Welcome.
I'm very happy to be here. Thank you, Sharlee.
Absolutely. So, with so many years of experience, over 30 years actually, dedicated to neuroscience and helping patients of all ages, what first sparked your interest in brain health, and how did that journey lead to the creation of the Melillo method?
Yeah, so when I was in graduate school, started out my career in the chiropractic world, and I fell in love with neurology and neuroscience in graduate school. And from the beginning, I wanted to kind of figure a way to combine almost like a rehabilitation approach to neurology. But as soon as I graduated, I went into a subspecialty of neurology and what we call functional neurology. But what really sparked a lot of my interest is when my own son was labeled as having ADHD at a young age. And I wanted to know what that was, what that meant, what was happening in his brain. At the time, I was already teaching. I was always a professor, graduate professor of neurology. So I knew a lot about neurology in the brain at the time, but I didn't really understand what ADHD was or what was happening. And so that kind of started me down the road. And all three of my kids have had different issues, but I also knew that they were also uniquely gifted in certain areas. So, that kind of got me down the road as to trying to figure out my own kids and along the way, help out other kids and also adults with different types of issues.
Awesome. And so for those of us that are new to your work, what is a functional disconnection? As I look through your website and look through the course offerings and your books, you talk a lot about functional disconnection within the brain. So can you talk to us a little bit about what that is and why do you see it as the root cause of so many neurological and mental health challenges?
Yeah, well, I think, in my my first textbook that I wrote and published in 2004 that I started writing in the 1990s, in that point in time, Bill Clinton had declared the 90s the decade of the brain. And all of this new brain research started coming out, and also development of new tools to look at the brain in different ways, in more functional ways, meaning that we could actually look and measure the brain in real time and look at it that way. And so we're able to get a window into some issues and disorders that had not been able to be looked at before. And so in the past, we looked at things that were like lesions in the brain or injuries, or people had the concept of biochemical imbalances, which really don't exist. And now everything started shifting towards understanding that in most mental health and developmental issues, there's no actual injury in the brain, there's no damage, there's no pathology. And when we take images of the brain looks perfectly normal. So, but when we started looking at the connectivity of networks and how information was shared, that's where we saw that the problem seemed to become more apparent. And so the concept of functional connectivity, and that most neurological, psychiatric or psychological or mental health issues revolved around problems with functional connectivity. And so along with that came the idea that what was the problem? And the problem was where there was a functional disconnection between different networks in the brain. And so that's really where all the research has been, at least over the past 20 years. And it still is today. And understanding, so then the work was, okay, how does it get that way? And for me, it all went back to development and understanding brain development. And, it's been a lifelong, I also have a degree in neuropsychology. I also have a PhD in developmental cognitive neuroscience. So really, I wanted to understand the neuroscience and the functional neuroscience. Again, how not just, what the brain looks like anatomically, but how it connects and how networks develop and how the communication starts from the very beginning. And then we can understand how it ends up that way and then what we can do to change it.
Nice. Because you're absolutely right. Most research or most things that people talk about mainstream wise, we don't necessarily know much about those connection pieces. We hear, that the brain may have a chemical imbalance, like you mentioned, and that type of thing. We don't necessarily hear that there is just a disconnection issue. That's something that happened developmentally. So, can you discuss more about the Melillo method and how it assesses brain imbalances and how it does differently than other traditional approaches? So, things like cognitive retraining or behavioral therapy. How is the Melillo method different than those?
Yeah, I'll give you an example. I'm just telling you, I just finished doing a consult with parents. And this will give you an example. Here's a child that's in here that is very sweet, you know, from all accounts, perfectly healthy child. But yet the parents just described that he's outside the box, that he doesn't seem to fit into mainstream education. And
Mhm.
he's struggling in areas, but he's very talented in other areas. So one of the things they showed me was an IQ test. So the traditional IQ test, and again, I'm trained in neuropsychology. So, in the IQ test, there's different subsets of it. And in, when I went through school, we were trained that in any of the subsets from a percentile ranking, there should never be more than a 10 to 12 point difference between any of them, right?
Okay.
Now, this child was on the visual spatial side, which is very clearly more looking at right brain cognitive skills. He was at 90 percentile, which is very high, right?
Yeah.
On his working memory side, which is really more of a left brain factual type of memory, he was at 34 percentile.
Wow.
You're looking at a 60-point difference almost.
Mhm.
It should never be more than a 10-point difference. So how do you look at that? What does that mean? So again, in traditional neuropsychology, they're going to look at it and say, well, that test is invalid and it shouldn't be that way. All right, but it is. How do you explain it? And the way I explain it is the perfect example of these developmental imbalances. And it's really more not damage or injury, because this child has had MRIs and EEGs and everything in his brain looks normal. But the imbalance between different areas of his brain, which is really a maturational imbalance, meaning why is he functioning at 34 percentile? Not because he's not bright or he can't learn it, but because that part of his brain is still in a very immature state. And it's not functioning at the level of his age. So when we look at academic testing, we may see that he may be 2 or 3 or 4 points grades above in certain skills, but he may be 3 or 4 years behind in other skills. Again, that's that maturational gap. So that's one of the unique things about, I'm one of the first people to recognize this and understand it, and then say, okay, what are our job then, our goal is to create that balance, to make that gap smaller, right? Because the disability is in the gap. because even with everything average or above average, if there's a big gap, that child will be struggling academically or socially or emotionally in some way.
Got you. Got you. And so then just to dig a little bit deeper into that, so these are imbalances from birth? Like how do they come about? Like where do they come from?
Yeah. So first of all, they're superimposed on, I always say that every person that comes in our centers, we have two centers in New York, one on Long Island, one in New York City. Anybody that comes here, it starts with that they're actually gifted in an area. Even this child that I'm talking about, the mom went on about what a gifted artist he was and how creative his brain was and how his imagination is so far beyond what a lot of her other kids in her family. But yet he struggles with basic reading and math and those things. That's where looking at it and trying to understand what the root cause is and how it gets that way. And so it starts with a gift where we're all born, just like we're all either right hand dominant or left hand dominant. We all favor one side of our brain in the way that we view the world, what we call cognitive style. And some people are more extreme than others. And so people that are unusually gifted in certain areas on one side of the brain, have an advantage. But at a certain point, if that trait is too strong, it can lead to a deficit on the other side. And that can create these imbalances. So this often starts even in the womb. I would say that that's why, understanding human brain development and the uniqueness of human brain development is really important, because also human brains are more vulnerable to problems if our brain doesn't develop exactly as it's supposed to. Those milestones are really important and they're much more narrow. Many pediatricians don't really understand this. And they, right now the thinking is, it doesn't make a difference if a child walks at 1 or at 2. Doesn't matter. That's completely ridiculous if we really understand how the human brain grows and develops. Our brain is unique amongst any other animal because every other animal, most of their brain is fully formed in the womb. And they're almost adult size. Humans, because we have the largest brain per body size, but because we're bipedal, we have the smallest birth canal. So we have to keep our brain really restricted from growth in the womb, so that our brain is only about 20 or 25% of adult size at birth. And that means that almost 80% of our brain growth happens outside the womb, which means that all of those little steps really matter and make a big difference. And especially when all the biggest, highest level stuff like language and emotional intelligence and executive function are at the end, right? So any little deviation in the beginning doesn't seem like a big deal. But then when they're 3 or 4 or 5 and they're not speaking, or they can't read or they can't learn, and we go and we say, well, why is that? And we realize that, they didn't crawl, or they crawled in an unusual way, or they couldn't latch on and breastfeed right from the very beginning, or they never really over, or they walked, at 18 months or at 2 years as opposed to 1 year when they should walk. So all of those milestones really do matter, and they signify that this is all what kind of leads to this imbalance. And, the right brain takes the lead in development for the first 3 years, and the left brain. So the two things that make the brain really unique is our size, but also the fact that the right and left brain are very different from one another in the way that they work. And that is an advantage. All brains from the beginning of time have had a right and left side, but the more different the right and left side are, the more intelligent the animal. We have the most differences. And the way it gets that way is that it develops because of this shifting. And so if anything alters this development or the trajectory or this shifting of the sequence of the right and then the left, it can throw off and create imbalances where one side of the brain becomes too dominant over the other. And then, once that's established, We can change it at any point, but it doesn't self-correct on its own.
Interesting. So I know that your books and then many other things that I've heard that brain development has the most change in the first 5 or 6 years of life. Given what you've just said, which kind of corroborates the same thing, is there correction possible after that time?
Yeah, the idea that there's a window of opportunity that we lose after like 3 or 5 is really
Yeah.
true.
Okay.
The one of the, again, really great things of the human brain is something, a term called neuroplasticity,
Hmm.
which means that more and more we learn every year that our brain is much more malleable and much more dynamic than we used to think many years ago. And that we know that the brain can change dramatically, even from moment to moment. I mean, if you learn something new, like, if you're learning right now and you learn something new, in an hour from now, we could literally measure a physical change in your brain with different connections and with areas of your brain that literally would grow. And so our brain is very plastic and very dynamic and can change, but that change needs to be done in a very directed way and very specifically, and it needs to be done with repetition. And so our brain can change really up until the day we die. We never lose the ability to change our brain. So the idea that there's windows that are missed is not true. And we see that, our goal actually in almost every patient we work with, whether they're, 2 years old or 60 years old, is that there's areas of their brain that are still relatively immature. And we want to get that area of the brain to catch up. And we want it to catch up to where it should be. And so that means that we literally need to make the brain grow at an accelerated rate so that it can catch up when it's behind. And that's what we do. And we do that in measurable ways. We literally see that kids may gain 3 years, 4 years, 5 years, 8 years in a matter of months in certain skills. And that's because we can get the brain to even grow above normal rate. So, the brain can catch up. And these problems in almost all cases, when you know what you're doing, can be changed on a long-term basis. And so it's never too late, but it's never too early.
Got you. Okay. That's what I was just curious about because oftentimes we hear about those windows. And if we don't make the changes necessary with our children, if, things happen early on after 5 or 6, then their brains are going to be the same way. So it is refreshing to hear that change is possible even into, as we age into adults. That's awesome
And
to hear.
again, everything I talk about, I've done research on this and we
Mhm.
published at the highest level. So we looked at a large randomized age-matched controlled double-blind study looking at something called retained primitive reflexes in children, adolescents, and adults on the autism spectrum.
Okay.
And so we looked at really throughout the lifetime. And what we showed is that by doing certain interventions, by doing my method, we could show measurable changes in EEG and brain imaging in a battery of neuropsychological tests. And we could get dramatic changes in as little as 12 weeks at all age groups. So not just children or adolescents, but even adults that had autism. We were able to get equal changes in all levels. So again, we've proven that we can get these changes at any age, and there's it's not only in childhood where this can happen.
We'll be right back after a word from our sponsor.
Most of us spend more time at work than anywhere else doing anything else. So why not spend that time in a job you love? Introducing Triad's Jobs Marketplace, the only job site dedicated specifically to behavioral and mental health professionals. Featuring more than 1,000 open jobs from dozens of behavioral and mental health employers, and searchable by location, professional field, employment type, specialization, and more. Jobs Marketplace helps you find your next career opportunity. Full-time, part-time, or gig time, make the most of your time. To access Jobs Marketplace, register for your free professional account at hellotriad.com/BHT. That's hellotriad.com/BHT, and then click to Jobs Marketplace. If you're already a member of the Triad community, visit app.hellotriad.com/jobs. That's app.hellotriad.com/jobs. Visit us today and take your next career step tomorrow.
Awesome. That is excellent research. I'll have to look that up because it sounds really interesting. And as a parent to two children, one does have some learning issues and deficits. I'm very interested to hear that there are things and options that we potentially could have to improve his outcomes in his future. That's awesome to hear. Yeah.
How old is he?
He is 11.
Absolutely. Like I said, it's never too late. It's never too early. We work with small children, but we also work with all age groups, and we make measurable, dramatic changes in all of them at different ages. There are kids that have right brain delays that are usually gifted in the left side of their brain. And these are kids that might be more classic ADHD or have OCD or tics, or might even be on the autism spectrum. Then you have kids or people or adults that are very right brain dominant and may struggle with the left brain. And they're very different from one another. They're different personality traits. And, the kids that are very right brain dominant or adults tend to be pretty creative, social, intuitive, emotional, sensitive.
Yeah.
And so, my daughter and my older son was a lot like that. She struggled with basic reading and spelling, things of that nature, but yet she sang from the moment she was born, but she could start writing songs from the time she was 9, not even knowing how to read or write music. And so she was unusually gifted. She could write songs, but she had trouble writing basic, handwriting. She's a classic example of someone that is this right brain dominant. And that's what she does for a living. She's a very successful singer-songwriter in Nashville. And we do a podcast together called the Right Brain Podcast, because everybody down in Nashville is like her. They struggled with learning issues, or they may have struggled with social anxiety or fear of being judged, or struggling with regulating their emotions, but yet they're also incredibly talented from a creative standpoint, from a writing, from a singing, from an acting, from a producing standpoint. And there's some of the best people in the world that are down there, but they struggle with these issues, but no one could explain to them why or how. And so in this podcast, we speak to that community, and that's something where maybe with your son, that's what you may mean, that he may struggle with basic traditional learning, but yet he may be incredibly gifted and social and empathetic and have a tremendous imagination, or be a great athlete, or, something.
All of those things. Yeah. He really is. That's really interesting. I've never really had it described to me in that way, and in such a I'll say a positive outlook, looking at the things that he does do well and maybe bringing up the rest, but looking at those things that he does do very well.
Yeah, the point is they don't have to struggle. We don't take away their gift. We just take away their struggles and make everything, because the struggles are a byproduct of the gift. The more gifted you are, the more you might have that side come online too strong and too aggressively and hold back some areas on the other side. And that creates the disability. But that doesn't have to be that way. And it doesn't take away the gift or the genius that they have.
Awesome. And even in some of your books, especially the Disconnected Kids, you outline a lot of tools for parents much like me that are kind of struggling with that imbalance there. So what are some of the most impactful changes that families like mine can make right away?
Well, the most impactful one right off the bat is to identify if the child has retained primitive reflexes. So movement, the reason why brains evolved on this planet is because living things that don't move don't have brains. living things that move need a brain. So as soon as living things moved, they needed a brain to, guide that. So movement is also what develops a child's brain. A child needs to be able to move. The most basic foundational movements are called primitive reflexes or neonatal reflexes that are there in the womb that allow the baby to start moving in the womb. And then eventually, a baby around the end of the third trimester needs to get into the right position in the birth canal, upside down and backwards. They should do that without the cord getting wrapped around their neck. They need to be deep enough down in the canal that they induce the birth process. And all of that is guided by these reflexes. If a child was in a breech position, if they, weren't deep enough down, if the mom need to be induced, if the baby had a cord wrapped around their neck, if they don't go through the birth canal, all of those things impact the onset or can be reflected by the fact that these reflexes aren't showing up on schedule the way they're supposed to. And so right off the bat, a child is kind of missing a milestone. And then right from the bat, the first milestone outside the womb, if a mom chooses to breastfeed, is can the child latch on? That's called the rooting and sucking reflex. Most of the kids that we work with, and even adults, they could not latch on appropriately in the beginning. And they may have struggled a little bit there. And then you look at things like rolling over and doing the commando army crawl and then crawling on all fours. And all of those steps should lead to the part of the brain development. And each of those steps has a reason and has a purpose and should be there for a particular period of time. But if you're behind from the beginning, then you may miss the next milestone or be behind for the next milestone. And that matters. And that's all, like I said, also while this right brain is developing and then the left brain. So if at 1 year of age, these reflexes should then all be gone and they allow for the next stage of development. If they don't come on, they may not go away. And if they don't go away, now they hold back the brain and they can lead to this imbalance one way or the other. This is one of my main areas of research. Again, the idea of retained reflexes. We've known about primitive reflexes for over 100 years, but the common thinking was that, well, they automatically go away at 1 without any problem. We've been able to prove that, no, that's not the case. And if they don't go away, that becomes the root cause, right? So when we're working it, we're all about what's the root cause. We're not about just managing symptoms. A child has an attention problem. Here's a pill to have him pay attention. No, how about why does he have an attention problem, right? Or it's like if somebody has a headache, you give them a headache pill instead of saying why they have a headache. Someone has eczema on their skin. Why do they have eczema? What's happening? And how does that all relate together? So we're looking at what is the root cause, and the root cause is always in the brain. It's not in the gut. It's not in the body. It starts in the brain with brain development, and it starts with these reflexes not coming on and not going away. And then that causes the brain to stay in an immature state. And this leads to these imbalances, and all the symptoms live in these imbalances between the right and left side of the brain.
Got you. So, it really sounds like there's this kind of thin line then between genius in some areas and then struggle in others.
Since I was a little kid, I used to like to read books about, famous people that did really great things in their life or watch movies like that. And they always ended tragically for some reason. And I was like, why are they ending tragically? That whole idea that there's a thin line between genius and insanity, it didn't make sense to me. Why wouldn't they just be happy they were geniuses, and live a great life? And why did they have these struggles? And that really is the foundation of my work. And I've kind of answered that question in this. And yes, that is where that comes from. That's where you get these incredibly talented artists that kill themselves, at a young age, get addicted to drugs, or people that are brilliant, but they end up with schizophrenia, like John Nash in that movie, Beautiful Mind, right? This is where it comes from. And all of that is changeable. It's not inevitable. It's not destiny. If we do nothing, that may happen. but it all starts in childhood. We know that basically any adult level mental health issue, whether it's bipolar, schizophrenia doesn't show up into the 20s, but we know it starts in childhood. It all starts in childhood. And so therefore we can identify it early in childhood and intervene. And the people that are most susceptible are the ones that are the geniuses or that have the most gifts. But you may never be able to see that. Like we work with kids, especially that are non-speaking autistic and that are stimming and ticking and can't say a word and don't seem like they're even in this world. And those kids are geniuses beyond what you can imagine.
Agreed.
And everybody treats them like they don't know anything, but they're there. They know everything. They understand everything. That's not why they can't speak. But these kids are, some of the most brilliant people on the planet, but they also are the most severely impaired. And that goes together. But even that we can change.
Wow. And a minute ago, you mentioned gut health, that this does not, imbalances don't necessarily come from issues in the gut. However, I've heard from lots of parents, especially those whose children may have symptoms of ADHD or even autism, switching the food, maybe taking out some dyes, lessening sugar, does have an impact on their child's behavior, at least. Can you talk to me a bit more about that connection, if there is one?
Yes, there is. But again, it's which is the chicken, which is the egg, right?
Mm-hmm.
So in the lower part of the brainstem, as the brain is maturing, that's the part of the brain that's most active at first. That's where all these reflexes come from. There's also some other nuclei that need to mature and develop, and some that are already online when we're first born. So we have what we call a sympathetic nervous system, which is the fight or flight nervous system. And then we have a parasympathetic, which is called the rest and digest. When we're born, the sympathetic nervous system and nuclei in the brainstem are fully active. And that's for a reason. That also plays a role in regulating gut maturity. So we want our gut to be relatively immature at birth. And the reason for that is that we want our gut to be open and leaky to start with. And the reason is because babies don't produce their own antibodies at birth. They develop that over the course of the first year. And they need antibodies. And the antibodies typically come from the mom's breast milk. Those antibodies are really big proteins and wouldn't get through a normal, closed up, mature stomach lining. So we start out with an open, leaky gut. Most people don't know that. They talk about, well, your child has a leaky gut, and that leads to food sensitivities and inflammation. And, that happened to them down the road. No, they start out with a leaky gut. And if the gut doesn't mature, if the sympathetic nervous system doesn't go away, it stays open. They're not producing acid and enzymes in the beginning because that would kill those antibodies in the gut. As the brain is maturing, as the child's going through these early milestones in the first year, as they start to eat solid food, as they start to produce their own antibodies, now a nuclei called the parasympathetic nuclei should be emerging in that same area. And that starts to shut down the fight or flight system, and it causes the gut to close up. We start producing acid and enzymes to break down solid food. That also creates the right environment so that good bacteria thrive. Bad bacteria, yeast, fungus, mold, parasites, candida, they shouldn't be able to live in the human body in the gut, right? The acid should kill it. We also get increased blood flow so that we now start absorbing vitamins and nutrients and minerals from the food we're eating, and we move it along so we're not constipated. What we've shown in research, and other people have as well, is that any kid with any delays, and even adults who have had delays their whole life, that parasympathetic nuclei isn't fully coming online. If you've heard about things like vagal stimulation or anything, that's all about that parasympathetic system, which is primarily ultimately governed by the right side of the brain, and the left side of the brain is more sympathetic. They play a role also in the immune response. the sympathetic nervous system increases inflammation and the immune response, whereas the right brain and the parasympathetic are anti-inflammatory. So what we see is that because the brain is not developing and maturing, the gut stays open and leaky. The immune system is overactive. They have increased inflammation. They have overreactive antibodies. They form food sensitivities and maybe even things like eczema or autoimmune issues in their body. But it doesn't start in the gut. It starts in the brainstem. That's where the real problem is. Therefore, it doesn't mean that that's not a problem. So if we eliminate foods, it'll help. If we reduce inflammation, it'll help. If we give them the digestive enzymes, it'll help. If we give them probiotics, it'll help. If we give them vitamins and minerals that they're not absorbing, like B12 or folic acid, it may help. And so when you give a parent, they don't detoxify, so eliminating dyes helps. And all of that will help the symptoms, but it's not the root cause. It doesn't mean you don't need to address that, which is what we do as well. But you need to understand there's a deeper cause, and you also need to understand that we need to target things very specifically to try to also balance out that immune response.
Wow. Okay. And what is your approach to identifying and then, kind of solving that problem in the gut alone?
Yeah. Well, I'm not a big fan on just doing generalized diets because every child is individualized. What we see in the immune system, typically, there's two main parts of the immune system. One is called the innate and the Th1 system. Th1 is basically white blood cells. They're the killers. They're the soldiers, right? When we get invaded by a bacteria, a yeast, a virus, those soldiers are going to kill it. And, that's an inflammatory process by nature. And we have different white blood cells that kill different things. Neutrophils typically kill bacteria. Lymphocytes kill viruses. Eosinophils kill parasites and mold and fungus. On the other side, we have the Th2 system. This is the B cells and the antibodies. Antibodies don't kill things, but they're there kind of as sentries that when we get invaded, when we get bacteria or virus, it identifies that they're bad guys and it attaches to them and basically calls in the killers so they can find them. And then they form a memory of that. There needs to be a balance in those systems. And what we see is that in most developmental issues, there is this dominance of what we call Th2, where their antibodies are way too sensitive. And that's keeping their white blood cells the ability to fight off infection less. So these kids might have chronic infections, but yet they have eczema, they have food sensitivities. Nobody should have antibodies against foods. Nobody should have antibodies against their own body, like eczema, like attacking their own skin, or against their own brain, like PANS or PANDAS. That should never happen. So right off the bat, if that's happening, something is dysregulation of the immune system, and that problem is in the brain and in the brainstem, and that's where it starts. So we want to be able to, eliminate foods that they are sensitive to. But if we don't if we don't fix the problem in the immune system, they're just going to develop new food sensitivities. So, and every kid is different. So just putting them on a gluten-free or dairy-free diet or a Feingold diet or a carbohydrate specific or a GAPS diet, what we need to do is look at the blood tests and look for antibodies. And if these kids have antibodies, we look at about 200 different foods, and there's a finger prick test that's very accurate. And we can identify, like, I'll give you an example. We had one mom that had her son on a casein-free diet, so dairy-free diet. And that's fine, right? And she was concerned. And so she was looking at substitutes. She eliminated cow's milk products, but she gave him goat and sheep once in a while. But the main substitute was coconut. And coconut is probably the best substitute. Coconut milk, coconut ice cream, coconut yogurt. And so she was giving that to him, and she said, but I don't really see a difference in his behavior or in any of this. So we did blood tests, and we saw that he did have antibodies against cow's milk, also sheep milk and goat milk, but the most antibodies he had were against coconut. So the number one thing that would usually be used as a substitute was the worst thing this kid could eat to trigger inflammation. And that's why, even though she was eliminating cow's milk, she didn't see any changes in his behavior because the substitute was worse than the cow's milk. Now, you would only know that if you did the blood test. So we want to individualize it. And so basically one of the things we first do, but many of these kids, especially on the autism spectrum, they're extremely picky eaters. They don't feel hunger and thirst at a normal level. They may undereat, or they may overeat, or they may not feel full. They don't have sense of smell or taste at a normal level. And so if you try to change their diet, many of these kids will just shut down and not eat. And they could go days without eating because they're not really hungry.
Yeah.
And that's really obviously counterproductive. So again, even if you have the best diet in the world or supplements, with many of these kids, they won't take the supplements and they won't eat the food. So that ultimately you have to change the root cause, which is in their brain, which is in an area primarily on the right side called the insula. And it's a deficit of what we call interoception. And we need to change that. And that's often one of the first things we see. Many of these kids, their appetite changes early on, their sense of smell and taste. They start being more open to eating different foods, and they're eating because they're hungry, or they start getting full. And then we can start to modify their diet, and it'll work.
Nice. Okay. What shift in thinking do you hope your work brings to the way we understand mental, behavioral, and even learning disorders?
I want us to think in neuroscience terms. I want us to think in understanding what is happening to the brain and how it gets that way through development. Again, I see parents from all over the world on any given day. On a Monday like today, we get people that fly in literally from all over the world, and they've been everywhere, right? If they're coming here from Australia and China and Japan, they've been everywhere.
Yeah.
And they're coming here because they're not getting answers where they're from. And the first question I ask them is, has anybody tried to explain what's happening in your child's brain, or in your brain if it's an adult who's seeking help? And the answer is still now always no. No one's even talked about the brain at all. And I often ask them, why do you think that is? And they say, well, they probably don't know what the problem is. And I said, exactly. And so how do you think they're going to help you? If they don't know what the problem is, if they can't even try to explain it to you, or worse, they'll tell you there's nothing that can be done. And I'll say, how do you know? You don't even know what the problem is. How can you say that nothing can be done? So I want the shift to be that we really start looking at the research. We start understanding what's happening with the brain. We start looking at how the human brain is unique in its development. And we start embedding that in our healthcare system more and in our educational systems more.
Awesome. So for listeners who want to learn more about you, your work, your books, where should they go?
Well, my website, drrobertmelillo.com, has pretty much everything on there, as far as books. People can order any equipment, any vitamins or supplements or anything that we usually recommend. There are courses for professionals. There are courses for parents on there. There's a lot of other information, research papers. I published over 100 research papers. My lab, we've been very, very active in publishing. I have 8 best-selling books that they can get on Amazon or anywhere they sell books. I have a podcast, like I told you, my daughter, the Right Brain podcast. We also have the Melillo Method podcast that's out there on, Spotify and Apple. And there's a lot of information out there that people can find that. I'm very active on social media. I'm always putting out information that's educational. Instagram, Facebook, at Dr. Robert Melillo.
Awesome. Awesome. And I, for one, will definitely be checking out both the podcast and getting some of your books. This has really sparked an interest for me. And so I hope that it does the same for our listeners as well. Dr. Melillo, thank you so much. I really appreciate you speaking with us today.
Thank you. It's been great. I appreciate you.
And thank you to our listeners for taking the time to join us. You can follow us on our social media at Instagram, TikTok, LinkedIn, and YouTube, and more at Behavioral Health Today. And if you like our show, make sure to give us 5 stars and leave us a review. As always, the resources for this episode and an archive of all of our other episodes can be found on our webpage at triadhq.com/BHT. And we look forward to having you back with us next time on Behavioral Health Today.
We appreciate all the support from our community, and if you like our show, one of the best ways you can support it is by giving us a 5-star rating and leaving a review. Behavioral Health Today is a podcast part of the Triad Behavioral Health Network, all rights reserved.